Hi everybody, welcome to DC Online. Over the next 4 weeks we're going to have a number of interviews that I'm going to carry out with different people. So the first two are with my friend Patrick Mitchell. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Dougie.
It's lovely to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, cool. And we're going to talk about things over the next 4 weeks that we wouldn't necessarily discuss too often in church. So Patrick is Director of Learning at the Irish Bible Institute and the author of a book entitled The Message of Love. And our first talk is going to be discussing marriage. And basically, it's an introduction to why get married at all. Because there's so many people, maybe don't think it's such a good idea anymore. Anyway, before we get to all that, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you very much. I am.
And are you finished up all the lectures and all for the year?
Yes, we're just about all done now. All the classes are done, all the marking's done, all the exam boards are done. So we've had summer institute, so yeah, it's a bit of just catching a breather and then very quickly thinking about next year, but we get a wee breather now, which is nice, yeah.
So do you play a lot of golf now in July and August?
I might be found on a course.
Might you?
I might go on a course.
Lovely, yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So I enjoy that.
I see. And do you get the 2 months off work, or do you?
No, gosh, people think we'll see you next summer when you're on summer holiday. It's busy. You're always doing recruitment. We'd love more students. You're then thinking about timetable and preparing for classes, and we have stuff starting in August. So it's a cycle, but you get a bit of a breather. So I'll be playing in the Irish Seniors Golf Championship next week.
Oh, really?
I will.
Yeah, where's that on?
In Thurles, County Tipperary.
Lovely. And you lived in Tipperary for a while.
I lived down there, so it's a bit trip down memory lane going down there for a few days.
Lovely. Yeah.
I've persuaded my wife to come with me, but I don't think she's going to Cali.
Is she not?
I don't think she will.
I don't blame her.
I don't blame her either.
That's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'll talk golf again then afterwards. Yeah. So obviously we can't cover every part of marriage in this talk. So maybe we can begin discussing about how modern Western practice in relation to marriage and the biblical ideal clash.
Yeah.
So most couples today, whether they're gay or straight, it seems to me that they first of all meet up with friends, or they meet somebody on the internet. I mean, we never met anybody in the internet because there was no internet. Yeah. Or through socializing. And it seems that today in our Western society, after a very short time, people become sexually intimate, maybe the first time they even meet. And after a period of time, they then become exclusive. And so I presume that is monogamous. And then after that, they move in together. And this seems to be the steps of modern relationships. They move in together. And then after a number of years of living together, they decide maybe they'll get married.
Maybe.
Or not. And some then decide, well, actually, I'm not going to bother with it at all. Which what's the point? So, first of all, maybe you could describe a bit how the concept of biblical marriage differs from the Western, the Western way of things now. Yeah.
I mean, it's a massive and complex subject, and it's fast changing. But in writing and researching about it, it was interesting looking at how modern marriage, like what you've described, is very much the two individuals. They're doing their thing, and it's modern marriage. It's sort of I think there's two almost contradictory things going on. On the one hand, there's this big push for equality, so anybody should be able to get married.
Yeah.
And the whole legislation for same-sex marriage in Ireland, etc., is part of that legislation for equality. That's so if you're gay or whoever you are, you have the right to. So it's like a rights-based approach to marriage, and then you're pursuing marriage like a right. And then the other hand, what you've said is also this contradictory sort of thing. Well, why bother with marriage at all? It's irrelevant. So you've got a lot of interesting things going on, but I think at the heart of it is the modern individual. It's the individual seeking their own happiness, fulfillment, and it's the lone individual expressing and finding their own purpose and meaning and doing it their own way. So I think that's crucial for understanding modern culture, the rise of radical individualism. Whereas a Christian, this is where I think the main conflict or the different vision of Christian marriage is profoundly different in that it's not about the individual. It's about a covenant relationship, which brings the individual into union with another person, but that's even done within the body of the church. So it's I think modern Christian understanding of marriage is, I don't think, very well understood within the church.
No.
I don't think it's at all understood in wider society. I think it's just seen as strange and weird. And why would you keep sex only within this covenant marriage relationship? Like, I don't know, Dougie, remember, you're old enough to remember this, that there was a film, Steve Carell, The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Do you remember that film?
I do.
And I'm not commenting on the quality of the film or whatever, but it was a comment. But basically, he was the 40-year-old who had never had sex, and the whole plot of the film is to help this man find happiness and fulfillment. So sex is seen as the absolutely essential to your happiness and fulfillment. So if you're not having sex, you're actually harming yourself. And he needed rescued from himself in that film. So I think that's the modern understanding of marriage, that sexuality, self-fulfillment. So how do you even begin to understand what a Christian understanding of sex within marriage? And I haven't quite got to what the Christian understanding, but I think there's a fundamental huge gap between the two. Maybe we can unpack a bit more.
Yeah.
So I think,
how do you think living together, as in like cohabiting, without being married, differs from marriage? Obviously, as a Christian and a Bible believer and Bible teacher, you believe that God has a better way. So, so when you're talking to somebody and trying to explain marriage in those terms, what do you say?
Yes, I think, and that's the challenge for Christian teachers, is how do we present and understand a Christian view of marriage as something which is of human flourishing and is God's design for us. And I think that comes back, maybe we could go back in theology. St. Augustine, way back, 5th century, talked about the three goods of marriage. He talked about, if I can remember them, he talked about children, procreation, faithfulness, and then he talked about marriage as really what became known as a sacrament. It's this, the way that the two people become one flesh, going back to Genesis. The two become one. In the New Testament, this mystery is like Christ and the church, and the man and woman become one. So there's Paul talks about it as a mystery, a sacrament, a sort of a spiritual union. So there's a spiritual union of the two. There's faithfulness, and this is where marriage, maybe I could explain it this way. There's a theologian I love, Stanley Hauerwas, and he's describing the pastor talking to the people about pre-marriage counselling and what it is to be married. And he asks them, do you love one another? And Stanley Hauerwas says, what a stupid question to ask these couple as they're about to get married. Now, he's being provocative, but his point is they don't know really if they love each other or not, because he's arguing in our modern Western view of love, it's a feeling, I'm attracted to you, I'm in love with you, and maybe next year I won't be. But a Christian view of marriage is this love as a covenant commitment, which is of a lifelong union, and I'm going to be faithful to you, and I'm going to be connected to you for the rest of our lives. And that is the fundamental difference, I think, of Christian marriage. So that gives a security and a faithfulness of marriage. It's a safe space to raise children. There's a secure space for raising children, and it helps flourish in community of the church and wider society. So that's a fundamental difference, this covenant idea of community and promise, than the radical individualism, which is about my search for happiness and identity, and often in this other person. And if that person stops fulfilling me, then we go and break up or whatever.
Yeah. And what would you say, to people who would say, well, look, you're not going to buy a car without taking it for a test drive first.
Yeah.
And that's actually what's often said to me, right? From people that say, well, look, you wouldn't buy a car without taking a test drive. Why would you get married to somebody without living together with them first? Which seems like a very reasonable thing to say.
It does. And let me say, I have great sympathy with. I think it's a Christian view of marriage. It seems culturally out of step, but it's also become, I think, even harder in our modern world than maybe even it was in the biblical times, because in those days you got married very young. You know,
Yes.
you were married, you know, when you're a teenager, and so now what's the average age of marriage is probably in the 30s, and people can't afford to live by a home. They're trying to save money, so you're expecting, it's a calling of saying, okay, you're not going to have sex and be in union with somebody until you're 30. That's a very tough thing to say, and the culture actually makes marriage harder. But come back to your question, why not live together? I think all the statistics show that cohabiting actually is negative for marriage and negative for relationships. There are more unions, are shorter. Marriage divorce rates are going up. It doesn't breed that sense of faithfulness and covenant relationship. It's this test drive. I'll take you for a test drive. If I don't like the drive, I'll get somebody else or pick another car.
I was fascinated to listen to an American psychologist talk. One day she was on the radio and they were discussing cohabiting and so on against marriage. And this was from a totally non-Christian perspective. They were just talking about it. And the woman said something that I've never forgotten. And the psychologist, she said, I can't tell you exactly why, she said, but living together, cohabiting, is a very bad deal for a woman.
Yes.
And the interviewer asked her why, you better get a bit of that coffee into before it gets cold.
Keep talking.
And so the interviewer said, why is it such a bad deal? And she said, well, the girl, particularly psychologically, they're different, they're wired differently to fellas, and that they invest. And they'll invest in the relationship, they'll give everything, I mean, both sexually and emotionally. And then they end up often in a relationship where there's no guarantee of the future. And then within that relationship, they may end up then with an economic dependence. And the economic dependence is generally about where you live. They may have bought a flat together or an apartment or a house or whatever it is, or more likely just be in a renting situation in Ireland now. But they invest all that energy and so on together into this relationship, but without any guarantee of the future, without any promise of either, well, I mean, there may be a promise of exclusivity in terms of monogamy at the time, but not in terms of a long-term future. And so they're asked to invest in that relationship without the guarantee. And what happens then is that oftentimes they split up or whatever and they go. Or she said, what I thought was very interesting was, just from the comment that you've made about marriages where people cohabit splitting up, she said they often get to the end of that, cohabiting period of time, whether it be a couple of months or a couple of years, and they feel at that stage they have to get married. Because they've emotionally put all this into it, they psychologically and financially, and so they actually drift into marriage, not necessarily wanting to be married to that person. And I thought that's an extremely good reason to suggest that marriage is not a good idea, or certainly that's not necessarily the best way to get there. If it's just doing things the wrong way around.
I mean, I remember reading. She was a diarist in a newspaper, and she was very very one of these self-confessional type of columns that she had, and she was talking about her relationships and her love life. But I remember her saying, after one had broken up, she said she just felt so weary because she had to start all over again. And that sort of sense of just. I was watching this TV. I don't know if anyone's watched it. It was a TV series called Love Life with Anna Kendrick, who's an American actress. She's really good. I like her. But it was fascinating. It was just love life in New York of 20, 30 something.
It was a documentary.
It was a fiction. Drama. It was a drama over a number of episodes. But it was just this. It was fascinating looking at this. I'm sure it was written out of it from. It was produced from a book, I think, which was fiction, but it's based on real life. But just this cycle of relationship after relationship after relationship, and just the chaos that can cause for emotionally.
I imagine.
But then also children, and then you get all this. Just get a breakdown of family solidity comes with it, and I think we see that in wider society as well, with the breakdown of that sort of sense of long-term marriages, which provide I don't think it's a good argument to say Christian marriage is the basis for a moral society. I think the church is called to be the church, and we can't sort of say, we'll live like us and expect the society to live like us.
No.
I don't think but it is, as you look at it, you think the breakdown in family life, and you look at the complexities and what it does to children, it doesn't have good effects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the book, you talk about romantic idealized love.
I did.
You have a few great phrases in that book. And hypersexualized love as examples of 21st century concepts. Yeah. Can you explain, I know we talked about them a little bit, but can you explain why they're not biblical concepts?
Well, I think romantic idealized love it's the movies, it's Hollywood.
Disney.
It's Disney, yeah, very much Disney. You find there's this sort of narrative where you find absolute fulfillment and happiness in this idealized relationship, and really it becomes almost like an idol where this one person is the fulfillment of all your dreams and hopes, and you'll live happily ever after. I don't know about you, Dougie, but when I got married, it wasn't always happy ever after. It's hard work being married.
Liz, if you're watching this, that's not true of us. I know that. It's been. No, of course. I mean, I'm now married 32 years in September, and
well, we beat you by a month.
Do you? Okay, cool. So it's and of course it has been at times extremely difficult for me, and for both of us at different times. And I think a lot of the time, the difficulty in marriage often comes from external forces. When you have kids, when your parents get older, when you may have economic difficulties or whatever. Absolutely. I remember a woman I worked with years ago saying to me, she said, "I don't care what you say about love, Dougie, when the money is gone, the love goes out the window." and there was a lot of truth in what she said, because when people get into an economic situation where they're in real trouble and they're beginning to fight. But like after the boom and the bust, I saw a lot of marriages go under in the bust.
A lot of stress, a lot of breakups.
Yeah.
And I think this is where this idealized romantic love is it's a myth, that you're going to be somehow this couple are going to get together and they'll live happily ever after. But marriage is hard work. It requires.
Tell me about it.
It requires humility.
Yeah.
I think I give thanks for my wife because she's the most honest person I know, and she tells me when I'm being a complete jerk. She tells me.
She must have been talking to my wife.
So she's, that's where in marriage is this honing of relationship and hopefully spirituality, that you're called to be honest, you're called to be vulnerable and true. And that's where marriage becomes so that's a long way from this romantic sense.
Yeah, there's something very beautiful about it though. A couple of years ago, before the pandemic, we had a carol service here, and it was a lovely service, and the place was packed out, and this woman came up afterwards, and she was gushing a bit, and she said, "Oh, that was marvelous, wonderful," and everything. And she said, "I listened to you preaching up there," she said, "and I immediately went back in my mind to 1960, whatever it is, when I heard Billy Graham preach." And she said, "And I just think you're so like Billy Graham. It was wonderful," and everything like that, And we were walking out to the car afterwards, and I was kind of walking on clouds, And we're going out to the car, and my wife says to me, "Oh, it was a great service, Dougie." And I said, "Thank you, love, yeah." And she said, "But you're no Billy Graham." And I thought, knock me back off the pedestal that I just put myself on for a few minutes. Yes. But that's helpful.
It is. Yeah.
It's helpful to us to understand who we are and to have a reality to our lives. And maybe that's a lot of what we're talking about living in a world of reality. And because I was talking to, I don't know who it was earlier today or yesterday, about the fact that in our modern generation, I think that they're a lot more realistic sometimes about certain things than we are. And yet the incidence of drug use and so on, and extreme amounts of alcohol, so would suggest that they want to spend more time out of reality. Right,
In the virtual world, I suppose.
And in the virtual world, which we're now in.
Yeah.
But and you kind of wonder about that as well.
But I think we should probably say something about singleness too, because I mean this Christian idea of marriage is where you can be spiritually developed, but the Christian idea of marriage is it isn't this individual couple relationship, and this is this real idealized love is this couple on their own, and they're detached usually from anything else.
Yeah.
But a profoundly Christian view of marriage is profoundly challenging to that, because it says this couple really doesn't just belong to themselves. Their bodies don't belong to themselves, even to each other. They belong to God. They're in union in Christ. But then they're part of the body of Christ. And so Christian marriage operates within the church. And I think the beauty of Christian marriage is it isn't just for the happiness of the couple. Yes, they raise children if they're blessed with children, but they are to be a couple. I always like the idea of a marriage not being a permeable barrier, like a hard barrier around the marriage, but actually porous. That the relationship is open to others.
Right.
And the relationship is, therefore, within a community, you're to be a blessing to others in that marriage. You're to have a family and a welcome and a hospitality to that marriage. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And that's where singles within the church, they're not in that married relationship, but they are part of the family.
Yeah.
And it's really important that this marriages aren't this exclusive or idealized thing. Oh, this is the ideal. But actually, as Christians, we're single or married. We're all part of the community of the church, which is a family. And singles have to be embraced in those relationships just as much as a married couple.
Sure.
So,
yeah,
I'm preaching there, aren't you?
No. I think it's really important because, especially in the light of what you talked about before, where we're told by society that to be fulfilled you must be sexual.
Yes.
And so if somebody chooses not to be in a relationship and they choose to be celibate, that instead of being weird, that the church should obviously embrace them and look after them and so on.
And I think the church needs to really be careful about following the society's marriage is the goal, but actually, I mean, within the New Testament, it's singleness which is probably given a stronger thumbs up than marriage within Paul's teaching. Jesus, of course, was single, and Paul says, "I wish you could be like me, single," because he had this strong sense of calling to mission and a strong sense of eschatology. The future is coming in the present, and we're not just to live for this age. And so that radically changes. And it's to say our sexuality, our sexual identity, our sexual activity isn't the be all and end all.
No.
Actually, our calling is to be part of God's kingdom and looking to the kingdom to come, and that changes things quite well.
We won't talk too much about sex because we want to talk about it in our next talk, which is all about it. Well, it's all about erotic writings in the Bible, and I'm using that word because you put it in your book
to
get myself out of trouble. But one of the things you describe with marriage as Christian marriage as subversive love, and I like that term. I think it's very interesting. What do you mean by subversive love?
Yeah.
What's subversive about it?
I think it is to subvert something is to sort of turn it upside down in a subtle way. It isn't totally revolutionary. It isn't. So what I mean by that is you go back into the New Testament. I'm thinking particularly Ephesians 5, and where Paul talks about marriage. He also talks 1 Corinthians 7. But I think it's a subversive picture in terms of the Greco-Roman world and how they viewed marriage and relationships. And I don't think we really appreciate, or rarely do we appreciate, just how radical, subversive and challenging Paul's teaching is. So within the Greco-Roman world, you had very hierarchical structure of society. You have economically between the elite and then a lot of ordinary working people, and then 20-30% of slaves, which kept the whole economic system going. Within that elite, you had men and women, and you had the paterfamilias, the ruler of the household, the man. So you had hierarchical relationships between men and women, and then within different social structures. And within that world, I mean, the household codes were quite common, and there were different patterns the way men and women would relate, and slaves and owners and parents and children. And it's interesting, Paul takes up these household codes in Colossians and in Ephesians, and he subverts them. He uses them and he refers to them, but he doesn't just go with the culture. So he starts to subvert them. So
we were doing a study some time ago on 1 Corinthians, and sure, you spoke at it on 1 Corinthians 13, and I was really interested in it because at the same time we were doing it, I was reading Tom Holland's book Dominion. And he's an English. I haven't read it, but have you not? An English historian, and he. So it's a secular book. It's not. But his whole thesis in the book is that the whole of Western society changed because of Christianity, and that's undeniable, and that actually it still affects the whole world today. He even says wokeness is as a result of Christianity.
Search for justice, really.
And so he talks about all those things. But one of the things he did in it, he talked about Greco-Roman society, and I was kind of a bit amazed with some of the stuff in it, because he said like a male Roman man, basically he would have sex with whoever he wanted to, a slave or a prostitute, and to him it was the same as just urinating at the side of the street. And even within Roman society, it wasn't considered adultery unless you had sex with another person of the same stature as yourself, a citizen. And so their world, as you say, this very male-dominated world and so on. I mean, in Greek society, I knew that women weren't even allowed out at all. And the Greek wife had a pretty terrible life, really, They weren't educated and so on. And I think a lot of people, when they read, Paul's letters like to the church at Ephesus and Corinthians and so on, within our Western society today, I think that he's greatly misunderstood. And one of the words that he uses is submission. I think the only time we hear submission in today's society is part of an S&M context. And so let's just discuss for a minute how maybe that relates to modern marriage, or how maybe it related to the marriage at the time and relates to modern marriage, because he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body. And now the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. And that would be considered a very, very old-fashioned concept in our modern society. And most people have taken out the marriage vows now to promise to obey their husband and so on.
That's right.
And so, first of all, maybe you could describe as to what you think Paul was getting at then, and also how that reflects in Christian marriage today. Should wives still submit to their husbands?
Okay, well, maybe because, you're really asking that question around, well, what do I mean by subversion? Well, how does it subvert? And I think we have to read that back into the context of the time. And it's fascinating what's going on in Ephesians 5. And I could say, really, if you want more detailed, read my chapter in the book, okay? Because it is a detailed question. It's not easy to answer in a few lines. But what's happening is...
But you're going to try.
I'm going to try. Who is he really addressing in that passage? I think what's fascinating is, and even your question is, and so many people, the wives should submit. It's all aimed at the wives, telling them to submit to the husbands, right? So that's the first point. Actually, that's not the focus of what Paul's saying at all. I mean, when you read, yes, he says it, but almost in passing. And he's also said in verse 21, all Christians submit to one another. Submission is for all people. It's not just a one-way process of wives to husbands. All Christians are to submit to one another. That's the first point. And I think it's a profoundly Christian concept because he roots that in Jesus. And to submit is almost... John Stott has a commentary on Ephesians I read many years ago, and he has a lovely illustration which made me think a lot, because he says almost when you think about what love is and what submission is, it's almost impossible to tell them apart, really. Because if you're loving somebody, you're going to do things for them. You're going to want their flourishing. You want to bless them in every way. And to submit to somebody is that's what it's doing. It's giving up yourself to bless others. And there isn't a sense of hierarchy and power here. And this is where it's subversive. He's giving agency to the wife. Submit to your husband. It's her agency, as in you were in the Lord together. And so it changes that hierarchical pattern of male over female. Actually, now you are united one in Christ, and you're to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he says slaves and children also have agency, but they are also one in Christ. And you very quickly see how this is so radical for the ancient world. What you've described, absolutely right, these hierarchical power structures. And Paul is now saying, wives, let me stay with the focus. The focus is on the husbands. That's my point.
Yeah.
Why is the focus on the husbands? Because he says at least 4 or 5 times, love your wives. And then he roots that in what Christ has done for you and how Christ loved the church. And the focus is on the husbands because they have all the power.
Yeah.
They are in the hierarchical situation. And he's subverting this hierarchical power structure to say, Christian husbands, you are now called to love your wife as your own body, as yourself. He's the one with all the power and the status. He is to love his wife just as that, his own status and his own body. That was a truly revolutionary thing to say. He's in power. He's to love her and he's to honour her as his own status and power in his own body. As he treat himself, he's to love his wife. And that's fairly radical. And you could see how this subverts the power structures of the ancient world. Yeah. It changes male-female relationships. And my goodness, you can go into slavery. What you've described there, you can see how subversive that is. If you're suddenly had this sort of relationship of power and use for sex or whatever, and suddenly you're sitting in church together, worshipping the one God, you're united in Christ together, and he says, slaves and owners are to treat each other rather differently than how they've been treating each other. So there's a social political revolution there in what Paul says about marriage and about children and about slavery. That's profoundly, and it's really beautiful. It's saying there's an equality in Christ, and the focus is on the husbands, and even the imagery is fascinating. Around, he's to care for her, he's to wash her. It's like the bride of Christ. The wrinkles are getting ironed out, and somebody has said it's almost like he's been asked to do all these female tasks. Yeah, washing, caring, ironing. And he's been called to do this. Forget the earning. out of love. This is the type of love that Christ has for the church, and that's the type of love that a husband is to have for the wife. That's truly, it's beautiful and it's revolutionary.
And why do you think the church got it so badly wrong afterwards? Yeah. Because when you think about it, I mean, if the whole idea was transference of power, which, and I think, that's really important. Like, we're going through John's Gospel here at the moment. Yeah. And one thing that has struck me very forcibly as we've gone through the gospel is how Jesus transferred power to people. Like, for instance, when he met the woman at the well, he's male, he's Jewish, he's he's a rabbi. She's a woman there who is obviously has some social difficulties. She's a woman and she's a Samaritan, and yet he goes to her and asks for help. So he immediately transfers all the power that he has to her. And I think that to me is so powerful as an image of, how as Christians we should behave, not with each other and with the wider world. And so I know we're sticking this within
this is submission and
within marriage.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'm sure there's a long strand to that. I think I think in more recent times, there's been a whole complementarian theology, which is a sort of strong gender roles, particular roles for men and women. And I don't know if maybe we can talk about that in the other podcast, but I think there's issues there around importing back. I think it imports back the hierarchy actually into the text that isn't there. Yeah. I think it's more cultural. It's reflecting the culture rather than the text. And I think it can be a misunderstanding of submission. Submission's like a dirty word in our world today, isn't it? You don't submit to you don't want to submit to anybody, really. I mean, who has the authority of power?
No, it's all about exerting your own thoughts and ideas and yourself.
And you think you can misuse power and authority. Yeah. And so submission is, but actually submission is a beautiful Christian principle of how God treats us and how he acts towards us. So I think it can be a misunderstanding of submission.
Yeah.
I think it can be a misunderstanding of the text, and I think we struggle with, we want to have clear authority structures, but I think the Christian faith is a relationship of love and self-giving, which doesn't easily sit with hierarchies.
No.
Yeah.
And yet we have them everywhere. Yeah. I mean, I know that that Old Testament Genesis, people go back there a lot, and in certain parts of the church, where after the Adam and Eve are chucked out of Eden, when God says, "I'll make your pains in childbearing very severe," he says to the woman. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. And I think that a lot of the time people interpret that as, that is, like, for instance, John Stott, who you mentioned earlier, he believed right through that there was a structure there, that there was not necessarily hierarchical, but that God had deemed this to be the way. Personally, I think I don't agree with him. I think that when I read that section in Genesis, I think that was the curse, and that actually Jesus came to change the curse, and therefore, instead of husbands ruling over wives, I think he was saying this is what will happen now because of sin, not because this is God's ideal.
I read that way.
And I think that maybe that's part of what has caused this idea somehow that men should be dominant, and like that's the way I was brought up, believing that,
and it's there's a long trajectory in culture and a patriarchal society, etc. And I'm not saying everything to do with the past is wrong, and I don't think we have everything right.
Certainly not.
And so you need a good dose of humility in all of this. But I think at the heart of Christianity is this. And I'm not saying even there's no such thing as leadership, and there is leadership in the scriptures, but I just think in terms of importing hierarchical power structures into a relationship, like I've been married 32 years, I don't actually understand the teaching that sort of says the husband must lead and be the boss of the wife, or must be the one in charge. And it's just all that language, I just don't understand what it can mean, because if you're in a union of two people, you talk, you work it out, you discuss, you love one another. You, at times I'll defer to Enos because she'll know a whole lot more stuff than I do.
Of course, yeah.
So in that give and take of a relationship, I just never have understood what it means that there must be a gender role of authority of the man over the woman. I just don't know what it means to be honest.
I mean, Liz and I did some what do they call them? Wedding, when people get married, pre-marriage courses, and so we were using this book that had this section in it, and so we did it with the first couple, and we talked through the stuff or whatever. And the next one we were doing, we got to this section about gender roles or whatever, and I said to her, I can't teach this anymore because it's simply just not true. It's not true in our lives, and I don't believe it. And we talked about it, and she said, no, well, I don't believe it either. And I said, okay, I have to figure out a way. And then I came to you, actually, because we were doing some stuff in the church.
Right.
And you led me to the parakeet,
the Blue Parakeet.
The Blue Parakeet by Scott McKnight, And that was a great book. I felt, on opening up the whole idea of gender equality, or at least, discussing how the Bible actually is talking about these things within the context and so on. And I found that really helpful, Okay, one final question that I wanted to just discuss, because before we say goodbye until next week. And even though we're going to record it in 5 minutes after we've had a coffee. So I remember reading a book by Tim Keller some years ago, and it really struck me, this Counterfeit Gods. The Empty Promises of Money, Sex and Power, and the Only Hope That Matters. A very long title. But one of the points he made was that we can turn relationships into idolatry. Family relationships, but particularly I think in our current world, we have this ideal of marriage, of this, or just of relationships, right? Where people rely on each other to form this perfect world that they want to live in, and he says those relationships can't deliver. It's not possible to deliver what we're asking them to. And actually, we therefore may ruin the relationship by idolizing it, or by making it into an idol.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think Keller's spot on. I think he's brilliant on so many things. He's I think this comes back to that romantic idealized view of the relationships we were talking about earlier, where you make this other person or this relationship as the goal of life. And I think it can happen in the church, Dougie. We can idolize. I think the church has a big problem with idolizing the family. Yeah, this is the ideal. This is what everybody should aspire to. Oh, you're not married. Oh dear, there's a problem. Yeah, and that's a truly un-Christian attitude to relationships and family. So we can idolize certain relationships or idolize this as if it's going to be the source of happiness and fulfillment, where really the source of happiness and fulfillment is serving the Lord wherever you're. That's the thrust of 1 Corinthians 7. Is wherever you are, get on and serve the Lord. Don't always seek to be somewhere else. Yeah. Don't always seek, I'll be happy when. But actually get on with serving the Lord and loving others and being a disciple where you are. And if things change, fine, but don't always think, I will only be happy at that point, because that's not how life works. Yeah, I think that's a danger for Christians, I think. And that it comes back to singleness and marriage, that we need a really good, robust theology of singleness. And I think we do usually a terrible job on teaching about singleness and affirming singleness as a gifting within the New Testament. And within the early church, they taught singleness was the higher ideal. They sort of, if you're going to be married, maybe, okay. But actually, Augustine and others were actually trying to defend marriage and saying, look, there is value in it, because singleness was the dominant. We're going to discuss Augustine a bit more next week, because he had a few funny views, I think. He did. And apart from great views as well, he had a few funny ones. Yeah. So anyway, next week we're going to talk about erotica in the Bible, and I'm looking forward to that no end. I don't know what it's going to be like, but we're going to talk about that. And I think it's interesting that at the end of our conversation we've come back to maybe looking at the ideal is actually singleness and not marriage at all. I don't know. I hope that gives you something to think about. I'd say both options. Yeah, okay. So listen, thanks so much for doing this talk with me this morning, and thanks everybody for watching and for listening, and I hope that next week you'll be just as interested. Okay, thank you. Thank you.